When you check into a hotel and you present your ID, do you ever think that you're giving away far more personal information than necessary? The hotel only wants to prove your identity, but now they also know your age, weight, home address, driver's license number, and more. As soon as you hand it over, you lose control. We're often asked to give away too much of our private data. Once it's out of your hands, that information can become susceptible to hacking, the sale of your personal data, or a barrage of unwanted ads. But what if there was an option to verify your personal information without giving away unnecessary, critical, private details? Verifiable Credentials, a pillar of Web 5, solves this. There are digital certificates of claims that are easily shared in a private and secure way. They can prove your legal name, age, ownership of an asset, or anything really. Verifiable Credentials limit the amount of data you share to only what's required, and they can't be tampered with or faked. Let's reimagine how identification could work. With Web 5, the government issues a verifiable credential that proves your identity and lives in what we call an identity wallet. So now when you check into the hotel, you present the front desk with a verifiable credential and share only what the hotel needs. This establishes that you are who you say you are, without giving away more personal information than you'd like. Verifiable credentials make proving claims easier, more private, and more secure.
Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. If this is your first time tuning in, you're watching TBD TV, and this is basically a weekly live stream where we talk with SSI experts. So before we dive into today's topic and stuff like that, I want to wait for a few more people to tune in. So I'll give you all a sneak peek of what these live streams are usually like.
In the music industry, why people get overwhelmed with it is this is it. This is the music industry. If you zoom,
that's crazy.
This is every participant and every legal contract. And so, yes, it's really complex. But if you simplify it into a supply chain as a precursor to why SSI, why decentralized identity is so important, you have a lot of different industry identifiers. This is how you get paid, and your music, where it's used, gets tracked throughout the world.
When we were learning about Web 5, it really showed that there's so many possibilities regarding user safety and privacy that you can do with Web 5. So which is what the main focus we wanted our app to embody.
Especially with the ride-sharing experience, in doing our research, we found we're especially concerned about protecting their payment details, their location. These are really sensitive pieces of information. We're really compelled to help people feel safe and secured in our version of a ride-sharing app.
Suppose a Brazilian banking institution wants to leverage your tools. What would the flow be like? What are the protocols used in order to implement this flow?
A couple of different ways it can work. Sometimes if it's just that direct institution, they'll integrate with us using APIs in the back end. So that institution controls the front end. They can control the wallet, they can control their traditional web app, that then calls Finclusive to do those compliance checks and issue the Finc ID for them. Finclusive can issue the wallet, but typically it's our partners are doing.
I think education is probably what the internet was built for, sharing information, sharing knowledge. Platforms like YouTube, Twitch, etc. have done a fantastic job of connecting people who know a lot of information. However, it's very hard for someone to go onto YouTube and understand that the person that they're learning from is verified, a good educator, knows what they're talking about, 20 years in the business or whatever it is.
All right, we're back. And just to let you all know about today's particular topic, we're talking about something called personhood credentials. And the idea is that AI is becoming so sophisticated, which I love, right? I'm so into AI. But there are some security concerns. There's the ability for AI to kind of be able to do human verification and break captchas. So we're trying to figure out different ways to verify humans online. So we're bringing on Kim with us today to talk about how the Decentralized Identity Foundation, OpenAI, Harvard, MIT, and a whole bunch of other organizations have come together to propose a possible solution called personhood credentials. So, hey Kim, how you doing?
Hi, great. How about you?
I'm doing great. Before we jump into like the technical stuff, I normally ask like some like fun, silly questions. So I have two for you. I know you didn't prepare, but I think they're not too hard, I guess. And I think it'll be great to just have a genuine response. And so my first question is like, if you could have a lifetime supply of snacks, of one snack, what snack would that be?
It would be Reese's peanut butter cups. No, there's no second place.
That was an easy answer for you. I love it. I love it. And then my other question to you is, are there any like movies or TV shows that are considered like bad, like they suck, but you genuinely enjoy watching them? Like for example, I like One Tree Hill. Everyone's like, that show's so boring, but I'm like,
Well, I guess my first answer is one thing that you reminded me, like I was really into Felicity when that came out, but the movie Xanadu, so it sounds absurd. It's about Greek muses that are on roller skates. So very like 70s, late 70s, early 80s vibes, like ELO does the soundtrack. It's a brilliant movie. It's one of the best movies of all time. So
I'm gonna have to look into that. I like Greek-based like mythology. I recently just watched a show called Chaos on Netflix. It's so good. They kind of like modernized like Greek mythology a bit, and it was really engaging. All right, so we did the icebreaker. Now we can dive into some of the technical stuff or just about your background as well. One of the things I noticed is you've had like this amazing career from like Microsoft to working at blockchain companies and then moving into decentralized identity. I'm curious, what was like your pivotal moment or project that solidified your commitment to decentralized identity?
Yeah, it was a high school friend, actually, of all things. So he was working on a collaboration with MIT Media Lab, which involved anchoring educational credentials on the Bitcoin blockchain. And that sounded a little, it sounded a little confusing to me. So, but I did dig in. I had already been looking into blockchain a lot, very interested, Bitcoin specifically, and the elegance of the solution. So I started digging in to understand the problem being solved, and the problem was what really captivated me. So there's the challenge of verifying lifelong learning and working credentials. How that was, and how it's still performed now is just very fragile. It can rely on intermediaries involving fees, or in many cases, they can be completely ignored. So for example, if you take an online course, it's too hard to verify. People don't necessarily trust the results. So you don't get to factor in all of these things you've done outside of very traditional credentials when you do things like look for new opportunities, apply for jobs. And so the problem of credential verification is particularly acute for self-driven learners or anyone with a non-traditional pathway. So, but then their experience and interdisciplinary background can make them some of the most talented and brilliant people to work with, and you need them on your team. So that was at Learning Machine where I was CTO, and that got me really hooked in the problems and ongoing challenges of how you can access your own learning and working credentials, but then importantly, how you can use them, prove they're yours, prove they're about you, convince others that they're about you.
I love that, especially since I come from like a non-traditional like educational background. So I love that idea as well. And then my other question to you is like you were mentioning you've been at the learning machine. I know that you've been at MIT and now Diff, and you've been at the forefront of just developing a lot of credentials or digital credentials. Has your vision for some of these standards for digital credentials evolved over time?
Yeah, and well, my focus has really changed. So, especially when I first started, it was all kind of, people had been thinking about self sovereign identity, verifiable credentials for a while. I was not plugged in that community yet, but my head was in and still is the ability for people to own and manage their lifelong learning and working records and the new economic opportunities that stem from that. So, especially at Learning Machine, initially where we were really focused was lower stakes credentials, equivalent to what you would post on LinkedIn, but instead making those have meaning, making them valuable. And, where we were thinking, where I was really focused is let's get these out there. It's equivalent to what people are using. It makes them more valuable. Let's get adoption and get feedback. Now, where everyone else's head was is government identity, not these sort of, lower stakes claims. And in my mind, still my passion for all of this tech is really on the sort of, well, not so much in government identity. Government is authoritative for government identity, and it is important that everyone has a government identity. But I think the real value in what we're building here is the ability for people to collect and curate and present all these rich nuances about themselves. So whereas before my focus was a lot on let's build out these, lower stakes, less PII, personally identifying data claims into existing systems. Now it's like, okay, cat's out of the bag. Let's ensure we have the most suitable architecture standards and frameworks. So I'll sum those up in 3 questions. So personal data breaches are already bad. Are we going to make this worse if you can latch someone's real identity and, social security number, all this to, if we're rolling out really high stakes identity. You need more sophisticated privacy guarantees, anti-correlation methods, ZKPs. And then lastly, if you're talking about bringing VCs into sort of federated identity models like we use now, sign in with Google, sign in, et cetera, a lot of times, adding VCs may seem like a win, but in some cases, the individual is just acting like a channel to pass through and allow more efficient data sharing between organizations, which again makes these data breach risks worse. So this 3-party model of decentralized identity versus the 2-party model is very important architecturally. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you went from like, okay, you wanted to have people be able to prove that they did something educational wise or anything like that. I think that's still very valuable because Angie was talking to me about like how, let's say your school shuts down and you do have a degree, but you can't really prove it to anybody. Yeah. But I could see how as you've been in this space longer and how as people have focused more on government identity, it's like, all right, if this is what we're going to do, maybe we need to start thinking about like this stuff you were saying in terms of like data breaches and how if we give this information to Google or other places that are not really known for being good with data privacy, like, like how are we going to balance that?
Yes. And the problem that you mentioned specifically with organizations shutting down, I remember that was one of our big challenges that we identified when we were starting out in Learning Machine. And so many people had the experience that their school went out of business. And I remember when we would talk to people in Europe about it, they were like, schools go out of business, or colleges and universities are like, yeah, it's real. I know enough people who've experienced that. And then basically, well, I'll share one more anecdote on that. I happen to live in California briefly, where if you apply for a job and they do a background check, you're able to get the results. I looked at the results. Now, keep in mind, this is quite a while ago, but they couldn't confirm anything about me because the references I provided, like my manager no longer worked there. And, they hired me anyway, but that was really revealing that the background check, someone who's paid to do that is just like, nah, like, we're not sure. So
that's happened to me before because like I worked at startups that they shut down and I'm like, I don't know. I guess I have my manager's personal number, like my old manager, and they just like gave up calling them. And you're right. Like if they ended up being a bad employee in the past and they didn't do a real background check, like that's awkward.
Right.
And then my next question to you, we've had Lamari on before from Decentralized Identity Foundation, but that was very early, like when I first started this live stream. I'm curious, like, how would you describe what Decentralized Identity Foundation is, what they do, just for people who need a debrief?
So we bring together builders and pioneers. And when I say builders, I mean in the broadest possible sense, not just developers, but people building their companies, products and services, designers, anyone who's envisioning these new experiences, services, and products based on strong foundations of trust. So some people are really interested in Diff for the ability to rapidly incubate standards and protocols. And that is a very valuable thing that we do. That's not for everyone. Many people are interested to just find a community, work together, and leverage the shared experience. And then we also spread awareness about what it is we're building here, what these new architectures based on foundations of trust are.
I love it. I love everything that the Decentralized Identity Foundation is doing. And I would love to be involved more. And then I'm curious too, like, in addition to all those things, what does your role as like executive director even look like? This is just me being nosy, to be honest.
Oh, it's great. It's quite a pivot for me because my background is just very, developing, very technical focus. I love it so much more than I expected. And I see it as people can take it a lot of different directions based on their backgrounds. For me, my approach is thinking about it as a service role, serving our members and promoting our shared goals that everyone working so hard in this space has been doing. So, what I notice is that people building in this space, they're running their own companies, and many of them are taking on the burden of explaining what these new architectures are. And so I like that I can help amortize that work and also give them a platform. They should be able to focus on explaining what they do that's different versus what is a verifiable credential and things like that. Now in TBD's case, you guys are doing such a great job of it. So I hope you keep doing it, but I hope to also provide more, education, information that people building in the space can use. The other area, so, what does it look like? I end up meeting a lot with members, existing and new, to learn about their companies, their challenges, and then working with our technical steering committee, Lamari, and other stakeholders to plan new initiatives and events. And so the other area that is probably less glamorous, but I oddly like it a lot, is the operational side. So, dealing with creating the new working groups and efforts and making the processes simpler for our members, for working groups, just making things run smooth so that people can get work done.
And I think you're doing an amazing job at the goal that you said of like servicing people and making things easier.
Thank you.
Yeah, at least from the outside looking in, I'm like, it looks great over there. All right. So in a second, we'll switch over to talking about personhood credentials, but just really quickly, just for people as a reminder that the TVDEX hackathon is happening right now, and I'll play like a quick 22-second video to give you all details. So now we can get into the meat of the conversation, which is about personhood credentials. First off, I do want to talk really quickly about like AI, right? Right now it's booming, it's amazing. Like we've taken these steps from like first AI was kind of like, okay, that's a thing that like PhD people do. And now it's like any engineer, even like a boot camp grad or like just someone that's really new to it can pick up a tutorial and build with AI. But there are some looming concerns or issues that AI can create, and I'm curious from your perspective, what are some of those that you think of?
Yeah, some of the big ones and the ones that this personhood credentials paper really focuses on are fraud, potential for fraud and misinformation. Now, to be clear, those risks have always been there throughout time. As we move from in-person interactions to online, it became easier to commit at scale. We saw this with election interference by foreign actors, but then AI is this next wave of just making it a lot more efficient and cheap to spread, to cause fraud and spread misinformation. So what we're seeing is deep fakes in the form of video and audio, and even just sheer ruthlessness, relentlessness of the activity, just having all these bots that can exhibit human-like behavior. And so for identity specifically, identity verification, you can divide it into, it's actually a spectrum, but you can think of it in two buckets. One is at the high end for online identity verification for these high stakes credentials, like opening up some trading account or something. Often it's common for companies to rely on to rely on video verification to make sure that you're you. Deep fakes are making it easier to break past that. So at the high end of identity verification, it's being threatened, but also at the low end of, say you are just browsing onto a site and you get a Captcha, and they're doing that to, prevent sort of bot traffic. At the low end, AI can now also solve Captchas. So we're seeing threats specifically to identity verification across the spectrum.
Yeah, that's kind of scary, bro, that they can like solve captchas. And I'm sure other people have seen a lot of deep fakes of celebrities or even just regular individuals doing like odd things. And I think that's also scary. Like, I don't know, the future of that is like terrifying for me, even though I love AI and I love that it can help to improve your workflow. But I think AI in the wrong hands can sometimes do a lot of danger. So can you tell me, I know backstage you were talking a little bit that this question could be a loaded question, but in some simple terms, what are personhood credentials for you? And maybe why should the average internet user even care about it? Because I'm thinking if I wasn't an engineer or in self-sovereign identity, I might hear personhood credentials and be like, what is that?
Yeah, and it sounds kind of scary for sure. And then, so keep in mind that what you're going to hear is my very opinionated angle on the paper. So the paper has, a tremendous amount of authors and it's great work. But getting alignment on everything is always a challenge. They did an amazing job. My angle in some cases contradicts the exact language of the paper, although I, fully agree with it, am on board with the spirit of it. So I want to start with more important than personhood credentials is the problem they're trying to solve. So I have several takeaways that I'll weave throughout. And takeaway one is that the internet will soon become unusable because of the risks that we talked about above. And we need a new solution. And everything else comes from that. And so it's actually too early to be confident in the precise details. But so let me elaborate on that a bit. So for the reasons that we talked about, AI now able to break identity verification and these across the spectrum, businesses and platforms that relied on these traditional forms of identity verification will soon be broken and they'll need to use something, right? So what do they have that they can use? Well, right now, browsing the web doesn't require a driver's license or passport. But if service providers can't rely on traditional methods, they're going to have to use what they can. And so risk could include, does everyone have to ratchet up the level of identification that they perform to get the past results? So it could have an effect on free speech and, especially vulnerable populations for your online interactions, but then also just given the state of personal data handling at large, that is a real risk. So personhood credentials are a method to address those risks, and they're based on decentralized identity standards, verifiable credentials specifically, but for reference for that, a verifiable credential is just an issuer making a claim about you. And in this case, the personhood credential, all that it says is this is not a bot. And so it relies on two things that AI can't do, which is pass as person in real world and forge advanced cryptography. So I think before we'll go through sort of a flow of what it looks like, but before focusing on specifics of personhood credentials, I want to mention takeaway 2. So takeaway 1 was the internet will soon become unusable. We have a huge problem on our hands, need all hands on deck. Takeaway 2 is we need to understand the problem and be very precise about it. So we know the characteristics of the problem ahead, but we have to be precise and prevent scope creep, right? Like, are we using these personhood credentials for authentication into services? That's example of scope creep. So it's very important that we keep it focused on what it actually is, refine the requirements, and then also understand the harms and risks with possible solutions. So again, takeaway 2 is we need to understand the problem.
Interesting. I never even thought about scope creep even being like an issue, but I could see people being like, wait, let's use it for this, and it just grows bigger and bigger. And then I had another thought that I was thinking about. What was it? It was from takeaway 1. I think I'll remember it later. But no. I think it was that when you started describing that it just shows this is not a bot, it kind of clicked with me how it's leveraging zero knowledge proofs, because I was like, I'm not sure how it does that. But so instead of like, it'll look at like maybe verifiable credential, but instead of revealing the stuff that are in the verifiable credential, it'll just confirm that like that person's actually human. Is that how it works? I know we'll
and it can be done, and that part's very flexible actually. Best of all worlds is if the credential just has nothing in it at all besides not a bot, but it could also be achieved through zero knowledge proofs. The main thing, the reason it can get into verifiable credential land is if you want to prevent the ability to transfer these credentials, then ZKPs can be very helpful for, say, like, using some method for a person to, in a zero ZKP way, prove that it's theirs without revealing any additional information. So it definitely comes up.
Okay, gotcha. So that's more of an optional. Okay, and then we can, if you're ready, we can switch into a quick demo. Well, so just so people know, the personhood credentials idea it's more of an idea right now. It's just research. So there's not really a demo, but I figured we can like kind of sketch things out, show you all diagrams just so you can have a visual. So I'm going to go ahead and are you okay with me sharing right now?
Yeah, that's great. And actually I ended up bringing up a diagram from the paper, and let me know if you need me to zoom in a little. Actually, I can see it. I'm going to zoom in a step more.
Okay, perfect.
And then, so this is at the core just a decentralized identity flow. I'm going to describe it a little bit more for how it works. So in decentralized identity, you end up with 3 key roles. So you have the user or the person who's at the center of this, and they own and manage their own credentials. They get the credentials from an issuer, and there's some prerequisites, and you can ignore the details. It's talking in general about decentralized identity. The issuer needs some evidence to say, I know who this user is, or I know that they're deserving of this credential before they issue the credential. So in this case, you can use decentralized identity methods to have an issuer issue this personhood credential. Again, you want it having very little information, like not a bot. Then the third party in the decentralized identity flow is you have a service provider. So say it is something like the low stakes end of the spectrum, like a Captcha. So a service provider might be the website that currently is demanding the Captcha, but now it would be saying, I need your credential. And so in this case, the user's wallet, there's some just behind, it looks complicated, but behind the scenes, there are flows to help the service provider and the user's wallet directly communicate and get the user's consent to share. So in decentralized identity, consent is important. And so that's one of the key principles. So then the user can just directly share that credential with the service provider. And the service provider learns nothing about the user beyond the fact that they hold this valid personhood credential.
Okay, I think that was pretty clear. And I realized I skipped through some of the other questions that I had. I think I was like, oh, can you walk through a practical example? But I think you kind of did, right? And then
I think so. Maybe one thing I should mention is that the key parts, and this is why, when we were talking just now about the importance of preventing scope creep. And this was in fact something, it's common, and it came up throughout the paper, of just making sure that we're not adding on requirements. At issuance time, you want to make sure that the issuer isn't holding any additional information other than what they need. At usage time, you want to make sure that the service provider isn't learning anything more about you than that you're not a bot. And so those are some key aspects.
That makes sense. I think that's pretty cool. Thank you for this diagram. I think we don't even need the Excalidraw then. I think this was clear.
We'll keep it handy just in case.
All right. And then, so now that we got a demo and got a little bit of idea, I do have more questions to follow up, but we'll take a quick break for a quiz for the audience. Y'all, if you've never done this before, usually a quick quiz pops up. You can put your answers in the comments, and don't be afraid if you don't know the answers. It's just good to try. A lot of it we've already discussed so far, or a lot of it if you have tampered or not tampered, but used the TBD SDKs, you might be familiar with. So I'm going to go ahead and press play. Cool. I hope I've represented Personhood Credentials very well in that quiz, because that was just for me trying to read the white paper. But now I have more follow-up questions for you, Kim. And I think you kind of did mention this. One of my questions was like, leveraging mobile driver's license. I actually got this from like reading a conversation we were having with one of my coworkers, Nick, where he was saying, why would we need personhood credentials when we have mobile driver's license as a form of digital identity? Why wouldn't that be sufficient? I think when you were talking earlier, you kind of said it would be, we might be serving too much data to some of these websites by giving our MDLs, but I don't know if you had more to expand on that.
Yeah, so there's that part, and then the other part that we focus on a lot is, even if you're not directly sharing the data, what can someone learn about you? And we'll talk about things like correlation and linkability, but I'll get very specific in the case of the mobile driver's license. So the standard it has a couple of paths. One of those involves what we call phoning home, or reaching back to the issuer to say, is this credential indeed valid? So that would mean a phone home to the DMV or its contractor. And then that means that they know exactly where, when, and to whom you're sharing your ID. And so a problem with that is we need more work around privacy protections. The other part is, no matter what, the current approach in the mobile driver's license to allow anti-correlation, or to allow people to not, service providers to not learn like, oh, this is the same person who went to the convenience store, who went to the liquor store, all that. They rely on a one-time token, which on its surface sounds good, like you get to use the token essentially once, but the way that it's done, you have to fetch a batch of those tokens from the issuer, and so it ends up introducing some implementation trickiness, or what I would call an overly tight dependency on the issuer. The other thing, and I'm always cautious that people in our space might sound like conspiracy theorists, but DMVs can sell data. So oddly, it's part of the Driver's Privacy Protection Act that does allow them to sell data. And so I want to come back from the from that side of the cliff and say, MDLs are a great start for traditional identity verification and will help prevent a lot of risks that we see there. But for something basically saying you're not a bot, it's overkill, and we need something that can't be tracked and traced.
Yeah, okay. Now that you've explained it, that makes a lot of sense. I do think like MDLs are great, and they're like a really great example for me to explain to people what verifiable credentials are. I'm like, you actually already have one, like, and stuff like that. But I could totally see how it's too much to use an MDL just for proving that you're not a bot, proving that you can go into this website. Like, that's too much information being shared. Let's see, there's a comment here. Okay, someone's just linking to the Personhood Credentials paper. Thank you so much. And in our Discord, people were saying it's cool. Oh, I see. Someone in our Discord asked for a link to the paper. I can link that for you. And then they also said, by the way, and I'll put this up on the, hold on. I'll put this up on the screen. They said, by the way, how do you envision, I don't know if you would know this, but just throwing it out to you. How do you envision the Web 5 ecosystem as an approach to implement personhood credentials?
Yeah, so the Web 5 ecosystem works very well. They have baked in concepts of these things, these elements that we need: decentralized identifiers, verifiable credentials. And for example, the centralized web nodes, you could store your personhood credential in there and use it flexibly. The way that DWNs are implemented too, it could be used for some more interesting use cases. Like a lot of times when people think about verifiable credentials, they assume there's this very manual process of, I'm clicking on something in my wallet, right? But with decentralized web nodes, you have this, hub that's running on your behalf, and you could do things like say, I consent to release my personhood credential to services of this type. So it could allow for scenarios where there's kind of even less friction and more control, other than sort of clicking around in your wallet.
I'm muted. Great answer, especially even though you don't work at TBD. I'm like, that's great. I mean, I know you've touched it and stuff like that, but that's great. I didn't even think about like leveraging decentralized web nodes for it and all these other examples you gave. And I know I'm kind of going off script just because questions are popping up, but I love to like just engage with the audience. We have one from Sheila that says, what prevents AI from creating a fake of the credential created by the issuer? That's a good question. Is it possible for the fake to appear genuine?
Yeah, and that's where the sort of two principles behind the personhood credential approach comes in. So it relies on the two things that AI cannot do, which is pass as a person in the real world and forge advanced cryptography. Now, one thing that we'll get to probably a little bit more is that there might be more ways to implement this approach. That whole, when we looked at the decentralized identity ecosystem where you have the issuer and the relying party, in the paper, it talks a lot about, say, there has to be one credential per person per issuer. I'm not actually sure that that's needed. That might be overly strict. My personal sense is that we may be able to get by with kind of an upper bounded approach that might be more appropriate. So I think the thing is, like, the more requirements you add, the more potential for harm. But so we do want to use, like, where I really like that it's going is relying on these things that AI cannot do. But then in terms of requirements for the solution, I think we can, that's where, and I think in takeaway 2, which is we need to really understand the problem, understand the risks before we can be very precise about the requirements. I think that there's going to be a lot of flexibility in actually how it's done.
I love that you're like, although the white paper says this, here's how I'm thinking about it, because it's right now it's just an idea. And like
I'm probably wrong. So
no, I think you make a lot of good points. Like, why get like super strict if we haven't yet like decided on what the actual problem is? Because maybe we're narrowing it down too far. A question from me, and we're going back to like the questions I sent you, is that like I've seen articles about people expressing concerns about personhood credentials. They're like, oh my God, we're giving too much power to these like digital platforms. And I saw about this concept of unlinkable pseudonymity. I hope I'm saying it right. How does that address this worry?
Yeah, so I'm really happy they included that in there. So it means the sort of more straightforward way to put it is that the platform cannot learn anything more about your identity than this express goal. You're not a bot. So the idea is that, you know, whether directly or through sort of colluding with other service providers or even the issuer, in fact, this is another key part, is that they can't collude or work together to learn anything more about you. One thing that I also like that they called out is that now there are a lot of methods that data brokers, service providers use right now in your online interaction that independently of all of this are being exploited to learn more about you, like which browser are you using, where your eye is looking, where's your attention going. And so they do call out that there's only so much that personhood credentials can do if all of these other things are also happening. So this is where, you know, another area of the paper that I really like is that it's not just a technology problem. It is we need all hands on deck. We need regulators and, you know, people who are thinking about all aspects of the problem involved to address not just this one, but the more comprehensive risks at play.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that. It's not just like, okay, this sort of is a be all end all solution. Like there is a little bit more to this. We do have a comment. I think Dan is just like expanding on your answer to Sheila about like, can an AI create a fake credential? And he just says essentially anyone, AI or not, could create a signed credential, but signing would be done with a private key, which corresponds to a public key. If the public key used to sign the credential doesn't belong to an issuer who is a trusted verifier, then the credential would not be considered valid by the verifier. Yeah, a little cryptography for y'all. Okay.
Yeah, and actually, maybe I jumped around on that way too much. So, yeah, I think that it's important in the decentralized identity ecosystem that the verifiers can choose from which, credentials from which issuers they trust. That might be they have a allow list of issuers that they think of as authoritative, and that would be mapped to that signing key that he talked about, that public key. And AIs cannot forge that public-private key cryptography. More generally, people talk about trust registries or issuer registries so that service providers aren't saying one by one, I trust this public key and that public key, et cetera. They would be saying anyone in this network, but it's the same principle of you can't forge that cryptography. So thank you for clarifying. I think that was Dan.
Yeah. I think both clarifications were both helpful. And then my other question, this is something I was thinking about, right? There's people who they're not able to have like traditional forms of identification, whether they're refugees or homeless or undocumented. Like at one point I was undocumented and I didn't have like a social security number or like a state ID. So I'm curious, like, how do personhood credentials account for those individuals?
Yeah, and that is my focus on takeaway 2, which is that we really need to understand and refine the problem and the risks with possible solutions. So you point out a really critical one. Who is it excluding? Does it assume that they have some kind of government identity? And, would we really end up designing a web where if you're undocumented or homeless, you can't use the web anymore, which is, libraries perform a great service for homeless populations in terms of allowing people to access, like, what implication does it have for accessing the web at the library? So the requirements, the paper started outlining these requirements, and I think that they can be made a lot more precise. And I think that is something that we need everyone involved in. Diff is really interested in elaborating on that. So work with us to better elaborate and document the risks.
And then we have a comment here. It's a little bit more cynical, just a heads up. But they said this seems overly complex. Why not have humans put Bitcoin into escrow? And if you start doing malicious things or acting like a bot, revoke the Bitcoin, like with MicroStrategy or Credential. I don't know. My initial reaction is I don't even really use Bitcoin. So that seems like a barrier for me. But go ahead, Kim.
I do love Bitcoin myself. And I think so the risk, this gets to the risks again. So, but I think it's getting at a good point, which is that there are many approaches to Sybil resistance, right? Or, or not a bot, or, any sort of harms that we're sort of getting at here, which is the sort of abuse. What happens if one person is over collecting the share of the votes of the community or over representing their own voice or interest, but then now we have AI bots to the equation. And there's been a lot of approaches. Some of them rely on financial incentives or financial disincentives. And I think the main thing is that there is a risk on the financial side of exclusion for people who, Bitcoin specifically, there could be a lot of friction in accessing, but anything financial, are you setting up some kind of burden? There are biometric based ways. One thing that I was surprised about but thought was really cool was that, Sam Altman, who's behind OpenAI, has the WorldCoin approach, which is that is the brute force, let's scan everyone's retina. And, so there are a lot of concerns with how WorldCoin specifically has rolled out their approach. And I think that they're like biometric based approaches may be a way, but there's a lot of potential harms from that as well. So I do think that the point though about we need and this is actually my takeaway 3, which is that we need to explore and get data, get feedback on different kinds of solutions, because I don't think it's necessarily how that issuance step occurs, what that process is. Depending on the requirements that we come up with, I think that there is flexibility, and I think that different issuers could even use different mechanisms. So each of these may have risks, and so how we weigh those and how we balance those with the performance against requirements is just going to be an ongoing challenge.
I think that's a great answer. You're like, we're not stuck in our ways on how this should go. Like we can be flexible. This is just an idea. And then actually talking about Sam Altman, this is me being nosy. I'm curious how Diff became involved in the development of this research. Like, did y'all go up to OpenAI and were like, this AI is crazy, like we got to do something about it? Or was it just like a whole collaborative effort? Like, I'm curious.
Yeah, I have to admit, it spooked me a little bit that they reached out to us, because, when I say spook, like that you can read between the lines and say, okay, if people at OpenAI are worried about this, like maybe it means we have a problem here. So it's good. It's a good incentive to realize, like, yes, this is something to take seriously. They were already looped into some people in the decentralized identity network. I'm not sure how that initial introduction was made, but so Wayne Chang from Spruce, and then Manu Sporny from Digital Bazaar. Manu introduced me to them, and so they were already aware of it, but we're starting to tease through the issues like, can we just use mobile driver's license? So I want to give a shout out to Zoe and Steven, who were some of the lead writers, who they really, really dug in and wanted to understand and were open to different kinds of solutions. So it was validating as well to see that their independent exploration of it led them to decentralized identity, and they call out, in references specifically W3C verifiable credentials. And so I think that's that combined with the sort of realization that this is a problem that we need all hands on deck for is really mobilizing for our community.
That's so exciting, because in my head, like SSI and AI almost feel opposite. Because like when I was at GitHub, I was really focused on AI, and I'm like, okay, this feels like a whole different world for me, but it's really exciting that they're kind of converging, and that they're aware of each other, and that it's not like something to be separated, but like they can instead work together to just make the technologies better. I'm curious, and I think you've talked about this a little bit throughout this whole conversation on like, what are some of the main challenges you foresee in achieving widespread adoption of personhood credentials?
Yeah, and actually, first to what you're saying, I think that sorry, I forgot what I was saying. Well, I'll come back to that.
Sorry, I said words. I'm sorry. I think
no,
AI and
yeah.
AI being the opposite world.
I think, to me, what I really liked is, like, again, in decentralized identity, SSI, we always had the reputation of being like the hand-wringers or the naysayers. And in this case, I feel like what we're saying is that, hey, this is what we've been building towards all along, the opportunity to build based on trust and stronger foundations. And so I think that part to me is sort of how we can enable humans to use AI to their benefit and all these other benefits. But yeah, to your question, the challenges are the very human parts. So friction in obtaining the credential and using it, usability concerns. So we talked about the concern of the clicks, all the clicks that might be involved in wallets, and addressing the harms. And so when I say all hands on deck, I really mean it. We need usability experts, all these kinds of things to think through how this affects everyone who might be using it. Very key.
And then in that same vein of you needing like other people to join in, how can developers and other organizations start preparing for or contributing to the development of personhood credentials?
Yeah, and I'll divide it sort of into the ends of the spectrum that I had talked about. So, the one of the easiest ones is if you're an organization and say you're performing KYC and you're relying on video to do deep fakes, just know that that's just not going to be really available to you. And oh, sorry, if you're using on video to perform, I'm getting my words mixed up. If you're relying on video to do KYC, then deep fakes are going to be a challenge for you. And, mobile driver's license, things like that, those are going to be a powerful tool in your toolkit. Now, in general, so for developers and the broader community, I think the first thing about the takeaway one is like, we have a problem ahead of us, and start informing yourself now. And I think on Diff side specifically, the main call to action would be join our community. We have an upcoming hackathon. We have this community discussions. So whether it's following our newsletter, our socials, getting involved in the community, work with us on what I call takeaways 2 and 3. Takeaway 2 is let's understand this problem, understand the requirements and risks. And takeaway 3, propose some solutions. So that's what we're doing about it on Diff side.
Love it. And for those who want to know, like, where's the website? How do I get there? It's identity.foundation. And there should be links to like their Slack and other different communities. And I think you all have like working group meetings and calendars that like people can join in on. Okay, talking about the hackathon, I know that you said there's going to be in the upcoming hackathon, TBD is participating as well, but there's going to be like use of personhood credentials. Any insight on like what kind of submissions you may be looking for if anybody watching is like, oh, I kind of want to start developing with this thing?
Definitely. We have 2 exciting tracks that might be interesting for people. So one, Pinata is sponsoring a track focusing on personhood credentials specifically. And so Pinata has some storage solutions at IPFS. Ethereum Foundation is a sponsor as well. They're focusing on ZKPs. And so that's a good way to exercise it. And of course, we have TBD sponsoring. And so that's a good opportunity to experiment with some of those flows we talked about. In terms of how we look at submissions, we always like to see prioritization of user experience, privacy, all of these things. And a wide range of approaches and experimentation is highly encouraged.
Perfect. Love it. All right, y'all. We're at the 58 mark, so we're nearing the end. Probably just for you to know, Kim, the next thing I'm going to do is just show people some upcoming events, and then I'm going to play like a quick game with you. It's so easy, and then we'll wrap up. All right, y'all. So just so you know, actually, right after this live stream in 2 minutes, there's going to be a Twitter space with my coworker, Adewale, or Ace, as we like to call him, and a couple other events that I want to let y'all know about. All right, cool. And the game is, so it's super simple. Basically, I'm just going to say like a statement. It's not a statement, I believe. I just find like random like statements like pineapples belong on pizza or whatever. And you can
Nope.
you can do a thumbs up or thumbs down to the statement. And people in the audience, if you want to participate as well with an emoji, you're welcome to. All right, so let me look at what's the first statement that I wrote. Dogs are better pets than cats. Do you agree or disagree?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Cats.
I like cats, so I disagree. I think that dogs are a lot more work, and I'm lazy. That's what it really is. What about for you? Why do you choose dogs?
I have a dog, a big baby pit bull. She's adorable. So
I love it. All right. Next one is daylight savings time should be abolished. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Me too. I get my body cannot deal with the time change.
Yeah.
Tanya said, OMG, I have 2 cats and love dogs too. Into that discussion. Okay, I do a little spicy questions, keep it live. All right, and then the last one is breakfast food is superior at any time of the day. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Thumbs up. Okay. For me, I don't know. I think maybe it's because I'm Caribbean or something. I don't really like American breakfast food. It's so sweet. So
Yeah.
I'm not too sure. But yeah, love it. Thank you for participating. Before you go, is there any last things that you wanted to mention that you didn't get to say during this live stream?
Actually, I did want to thank Tanya for hanging on. I was really worried that keeping you entertained. I felt like a lot of pressure on that. But thank you for hanging around. Thank you for everyone who joined. And yeah, reach out to me. I think you know where to find me if you want to learn more about getting involved. Decentralized Identity Foundation will be focusing a lot on this going forward. So we'd love to have you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'll put up the link again. And I think a couple of people have been hanging on Tanya gave you a heart in our board on Twitter. It says 140 plus people are viewing. And Christy, who was one of our past guests, says didn't get to hear all of this one, so can't wait to watch the recording. So there's people that you've kept engaged, and I loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rizal. It's so great talking to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And have a great Friday to you. And thank you to the audience as well. I'll let y'all go now. Bye.
Bye-bye.
We announced it. TBDEX 1.0 SDK is now out.
TBDEX is an open protocol that makes moving value around the world much more efficient and streamlined. We're solving this problem with TBDEX by building a standard open source protocol that anyone can use for free and plug into.
We're super excited to have developers be able to start looking at this technology and start implementing it. We've put together a new financial protocol that we believe can fundamentally revolutionize the way that we think about transmitting value around the world.